Our second valid pattern is called modus tollens. It looks a little bit like our first pattern. It starts with the same premise. If P, then Q. But our second premise is different. Our second premise here is not Q. And what we can conclude from these two things is not P. So let's say your professor tells you, if you get an A on the final exam, you get an A for the course. Well, then you get your grades for the semester, and it turns out you didn't get an A for the course. Well, what do you know? What could you infer? You could infer that you did not get an A on the final exam, right? As long as these two things are true, this is unavoidable. This is modus tollens. So a simple example of modus tollens might look like this. You can see it's the same essential form. It's just an if-then statement, a negation of the then portion of the if-then statement, and that leads to a negation of the if portion of the if-then statement. But just like modus ponens, we can see modus tollens operating in more complicated sets of statements. So for example, this is also modus tollens. This is just a big, ugly if-then statement, right? It happens to have an if-then statement as part of this larger if-then statement. What this is telling us is that if this is true, then this must be true. Then we learn in the second statement, in the second premise, that this is not the case, not E or F. Therefore, we can conclude not A implies B, right? So again, think of this in terms of P's and Q's if that's helpful. This is like saying P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. This is modus tollens. So now we have two rules. Now we have two valid patterns. So let's do another example of a proof. Remember, in these proofs, I give you some information. Your job is to draw more information out of these givens. And I even give you the goal. I even give you the final answer. You really just have to get from these three things to this. That's your job. And of course, what you're practicing is drawing information out of information that you've been given. So we have two rules now. And with these two rules, you can demonstrate to me why X would have to be the case if these three things are true. Take a look at these three premises, and you can see that if you put a couple of them together, we'll be able to draw out new information. So for example, line 1 tells me that if A is true, then B is true. Line 2 tells me that B is not true. Well, we've just learned what that means. That means that A is not the case. We are entitled to add to what we know. Why? Because of our rule called modus tollens, and we're using that rule on lines 1 and 2. Now look at what we can do. We can take information that we just gained, put it together with information we were given, and that's going to get us to our goal. Line 4 tells us that A is not the case. Line 3 tells us if we have not A, then we are entitled to say X. So sure enough, we are entitled to say X. Why? Because of our first rule, modus ponens, now on lines 3 and 4. So in other words, what we're doing is we're adding to the information we have, we're adding to the information that we're given until we get to our goal. It's almost like a game, in the sense that you have a task, you know what you're trying to get done, and you have to use the rules of this game to get to the goal. But of course, they're not just rules. These are valid deductive patterns, and that's the point of the game, is to get good at using these valid deductive patterns. This is modus tollens.